The hallway went completely silent. Every parent, every teacher, every child standing in that brightly lit corridor of Westfield Academy froze in place because the little girl in the torn dress was holding something that no one in that building could have possibly expected. A framed legal document, an official will, and the name printed at the top of it belonged to one of the wealthiest men in the state. The man in the expensive suit staggered backward like he'd been struck. His mouth opened, but no words came. He read the document again, and then again. His face cycled through disbelief, through confusion, through something that looked almost like grief. The girl, small, quiet, with tear-streaked cheeks and a backpack held together by a single fraying strap, looked up at him with eyes that carried no anger. Only the calm, exhausted dignity of someone who had survived far too much already. How did it come to this? How did a little girl living in poverty end up standing in a private school hallway, holding the final words of a dead billionaire? And how did those words change everything? Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Amara, and from the very first morning of her life, the world had made it clear that it did not intend to make things easy for her. She had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights only worked half the time, where the corner store doubled as a pharmacy and a lending office, and where people learned early that survival required a quiet, unbreakable kind of strength. Her mother had worked two jobs her entire life, cleaning offices on weekday nights and folding linens at a hotel on weekends. And she had done it all with a grace that Amara had spent her whole childhood admiring and trying to understand. When Amara's mother passed, taken too soon by an illness they couldn't afford to treat properly, Amara was 11 years old. She had no father, no relatives who could take her in without conditions. She was placed in the care of the county system, moved between two foster homes in 3 years, and eventually landed in the household of a quiet, retired school teacher named Mrs. Caldwell. A woman too old to adopt formally, but too good to turn a child away. Mrs. Caldwell lived modestly, very modestly, but she believed in education like other people believed in religion. She scraped together enough to enroll Amara in Westfield Academy on a partial scholarship, pressing the girl's uniform skirt the night before with a care that said everything words couldn't. The school was a different world, wide, gleaming hallways, manicured lawns, children who had never wondered whether there would be dinner. Amara walked those corridors in clothes that didn't quite fit, carrying a backpack that Mrs. Caldwell had found at a church sale, and she kept her head up because that was what her mother had always told her to do. Keep your head up, baby, no matter what. And then there was Richard Calloway. Richard Calloway was the kind of man who filled a room before he entered it. At 43, he was the CEO of Calloway and Associates, a real estate and investment empire his father had built, and he had tripled. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He drove a car that turned heads on the highway. He spoke with the casual, unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been told no. His son Dylan was in the same class as Amara, and Richard Calloway, from the very first parent-teacher evening, had made it unmistakably clear that he did not think much of the girl sitting 2 rows away from his son. It started with a look. The first time Richard Calloway saw Amara at school pickup, he let his gaze move over her slowly, the worn shoes, the skirt that was just slightly too short at the hem, the backpack with the fraying zipper, and then he looked away. Not with cruelty exactly, with something almost worse, with indifference, the kind of complete, total dismissal that says, "You do not exist in my world." But indifference gave way to something uglier. It was at the school fundraiser gala, an event Amara had been invited to attend as part of the scholarship program, that Richard Calloway first opened his mouth. He was standing with 2 other fathers, champagne glasses in hand, when Amara walked past the table carrying a small plate of food she had been too nervous to eat. He watched her, leaned toward the man beside him, and said, loud enough for her to hear, "I don't know why they let charity cases into events like this. It ruins the atmosphere." The man beside him laughed quietly. The woman across the table shifted uncomfortably. Amara kept walking. She found a corner, set her plate down, and stared at the wall until she was sure the sting behind her eyes would not become tears. Then she straightened her spine, her mother's daughter, all the way to the core, and rejoined the room. But she had heard, and it had landed exactly where he intended it to. Over the following weeks, it became a pattern. Richard Calloway had a gift for cruelty that wore the costume of casual conversation. He complained to the principal that the scholarship children were lowering the academic culture of the school. He was heard telling another parent that Westfield's diversity initiatives were a misguided charity that benefits no one. When Dylan came home one day and said that Amara had beaten him on the math examination, Richard didn't celebrate the competition. He called the school and asked, pointedly, whether all students were being held to the same testing standards. What none of them knew, what Richard Calloway had no idea of, was that Amara had been watching everything, not with bitterness, but with the kind of quiet, careful attention that belongs to children who have learned that the world reveals itself most honestly when it thinks it isn't being seen. And she wasn't the only one watching. Here's where the story takes its first turn. Because across the city, in a hospital room full of machines and flowers he couldn't smell anymore, an old man was watching too. His name was George Calloway, Richard's father, the man who had built the empire from nothing. A man who, in the last months of his life, had become quieter, more reflective, and deeply, painfully aware of the ways he had failed the people around him. George Calloway had a secret, one he had carried for 37 years. And now, with time running out, he had made a decision that his son was not going to like. What no one at Westfield Academy knew, what Richard himself had never been told, was that George Calloway had once loved a woman long before he built his fortune. A woman named Diane, a quiet, brilliant woman who had worked as a seamstress in the neighborhood where George grew up, before money and ambition pulled him in a different direction. He had left her. He had told himself it was necessary. He had buried the guilt under spreadsheets and acquisitions and the comfortable noise of success. What he had never known, because Diane had never told him, out of a pride too fierce to beg, was that she had been pregnant when he walked away. Diane had raised her daughter alone. That daughter had grown up, built her own quiet life, worked her own long hours. And when that daughter passed away too soon, she left behind a little girl named Amara. George Calloway had only discovered the truth 8 months before he died, through a letter Diane had written but never sent, found by a neighbor cleaning out a storage unit. He had hired a private investigator. He had confirmed everything. And then, in the steadiest handwriting his trembling hand could still manage, he had rewritten his will. He did not tell Richard. He told no one. He only hoped, in whatever way a dying man can hope, that the truth would speak for itself when the time came. Now, back to Westfield Academy, back to the hallway, back to the moment that stopped time. It had been a Tuesday, an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. Amara had been called to the principal's office and told that a legal representative had arrived and needed to speak with her. She didn't understand. Mrs. Caldwell was called. The lawyer sat across from them both at a small table in the conference room and explained slowly and carefully that the late George Calloway, founder of Calloway and Associates, one of the most powerful men in the region, had named Amara in his will as his biological granddaughter and had granted her full legal recognition as a direct heir of his estate. Amara had sat very still. Mrs. Caldwell had pressed her hand to her mouth. The lawyer had then handed Amara a sealed letter from George himself. Inside it, in shaking but deliberate cursive, George had written, "I cannot undo the years I lost. I can only make sure the world knows who you are. You are my blood. You are my family. And I am sorry it took me so long to find you." Amara held the letter for a long time, and then she had asked, very quietly, whether she was required to keep this information private. The lawyer told her she was not. She had arrived at school the next morning carrying the framed legal document, the one Mrs. Caldwell had insisted on having properly framed, because she said some things deserved to be held with both hands. She had walked into that hallway just as Richard Calloway was arriving to collect Dylan early for a dentist appointment. And the moment he saw her, saw what she was holding, his face had changed in a way that no amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of confidence could have prepared him for. He read his father's name. He read Amara's name. He read the word granddaughter. He read the signatures. He read the legal seal, and the hallway went silent around him. Richard Calloway stood in that school hallway for a long, long moment. Around him, parents and children moved slowly, uncertain. Teachers stood in doorways. His son Dylan stood a few feet behind him, looking between his father and the quiet girl with the framed document, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the weight of it. And then something cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. It cracked the way ice does in early spring, slowly from somewhere deep inside, in a place that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time. Richard Calloway had known his father was ill.